Welcome to London's Old North. As usual, this video is designed as an aid to exploration. Log off the computer, pull up this video on your phone, and go for a walk. Each time I'm done talking about a building, I'll throw up a map to get you to the next one. Pause the video and take a stroll. Indeed, feel free to wander off script for a while. I'll still be there when you get to the next site, and there's always another side street to explore. Today's walk actually spreads across several modern neighbourhoods, including the Piccadilly, Bishop Hellmuth, and St. George Grosvenor neighbourhoods. A common thread, however, runs through the histories of all these areas. The north end of the city was laid out as part of the 1840 survey that extended the city's street grid north to Huron and east to Adelaide. The survey, however, proved wildly overambitious, and for decades the area remained largely undeveloped. It wasn't until the last decades of the 19th century that the area began to develop, first with the establishment of several large institutions, including St. Joseph's Hospital and the forerunners of the University of Western Ontario. These institutions, combined with the availability of large plots of land, attracted new residential development, with a wave of large houses being erected in the 1880s and 1890s, a trend which would accelerate as it moved north, with some of the city's most impressive residences being erected on Huron and Victorian streets in the early 20th century. Today's walk focuses on the southern, late Victorian portion of Old North, and begins at the corner of Oxford and Colborne. The church on the southeast corner of Oxford and Colborne streets is Trinity Lutheran Church, built in 1950 to plans by Werner Nafke. The church was one of the best examples of mid-20th century church designs in London, both inside and out, and is well worth stepping into if the opportunity presents itself. Among the major Protestant denominations, the Lutherans were the last to establish a presence, and as late as the turn of the century, they were worshipping in Duffield Hall, an auditorium downtown. A congregation wouldn't be formally organized until 1920, and it wouldn't be until 1924 that a dedicated church building would be erected. Even then, the original Trinity Lutheran was a small building of limited architectural merit. The 1950 structure represented an impressive step forward for the congregation. Leaving Trinity Lutheran, walk a block south on Colborne Street to Piccadilly Street. The Romanesque church on the southwest corner of Colborne and Piccadilly was built in 1888, designed by local architect George Durand. The congregation had been founded as a mission church in the north end of the city, and the new building featured an unusually large Sunday school in proportion to the size of the church. At the time it was estimated that the Sunday school could hold 600 people. Turn right, walking a block west on Piccadilly, to the corner of Piccadilly and Waterloo. The towered residence set back from the northeast corner of Waterloo and Piccadilly streets is the Somerville Residence, built in 1907 for Charles Somerville, a successful manufacturer of cardboard boxes, whose factory remains a prominent landmark in the city's East End. His residence is a late Victorian building dominated by a rounded tower. Lacking the profuse ornamentation of buildings erected a decade earlier, the house features a stripped-down elegance and focus on form typical of the Edwardian buildings which would dominate residential construction in the decade to come. Continue east a block and a half on Piccadilly. Stop at the large surface parking lot on the south side of Piccadilly, between Wellington and Richmond. The parking lot at 235 Piccadilly was once home to the chapter house of the proposed Holy Trinity Cathedral. The cathedral was intended to have been a truly massive structure, stretching from Piccadilly to Pall Mall, and serving as the heart of Southwestern Ontario's Anglican community. As a prelude to construction, Gordon Lloyd, a prominent Detroit architect, was hired to design a chapter house in 1872. The structure housed offices for the bishop and his staff, meeting spaces, and a large chapel. Its monumental scale reflected that of the building it was intended as a mere annex to. The plans for the new cathedral were finally and definitively dashed in 1888 when the Canadian Pacific Railway constructed its new London Main Line through the heart of the proposed cathedral site. Even by that point, however, it had become obvious to everyone involved that the project was beyond the capacity of London's Anglicans, and by 1884 the cathedral seat had been returned to St. Paul's downtown. The former chapter house served a variety of purposes until being demolished for a parking lot in 1982 amid a storm of protest involving heritage groups across the province. Continue on to the intersection of Richmond and Piccadilly and turn left. The building on the southeast corner of Richmond and Piccadilly was built in 1909 as a shoe factory, a rare industrial use in the mostly residential North End. Walk south on Richmond Street, stopping immediately south of the railway tracks. The Canadian Pacific Railway was a late arrival in London. Following the completion of the Transcontinental Railway from Montreal to Vancouver in 1881, the railway determined to develop a network of feeder lines in eastern Canada. The result was a scramble between the Canadian Pacific and the Grand Trunk Railway to purchase the multitude of short-line railways which had previously crisscrossed Ontario. With the Canadian Pacific locked out of purchasing its way into London, they decided instead to build a new main line from existing Canadian Pacific service at Woodstock, through London to Windsor. The former London station can still be seen on the south side of the tracks, east of Richmond. An impressive Tudor building, built in 1892, the building served as a railway station until 1971, and has since been converted into a restaurant. Cross back over the railway tracks, and walk 3 blocks north to the intersection of Richmond and Sydenham Streets. The large house, on the northeast corner of Richmond and Sydenham Streets, stands on the site of Headley, the residence of Sir Adam Beck. Adam Beck was a prominent turn-of-the-century politician in London, with an interest in electricity. At one time Mayor of London, Adam Beck later went on to serve in provincial parliament, a role in which he was the leading proponent of harnessing Niagara Falls for electrical generation, and the creation of an electrical network distributing Niagara power across southwestern Ontario. Famously, he was mocked in the press for envisioning a future in which electricity would be found in every workman's cottage. Adam Beck's residence is built around a nucleus erected in the 1860s, but the residence was repeatedly expanded, and the iconic tower and much of the remainder of the facade were added shortly after Adam Beck purchased the house in 1901. In 1989, the house, originally located closer to the center of the block, was demolished and replaced with condominiums, while a replica of the building was built closer to the intersection. Across the street from Headley, on the southwest corner of Richmond and Sydenham, is the original home of Trinity Lutheran Church, a simple Gothic structure erected in 1924. Continue a block up Richmond Street to St. James and turn left. Walk a block west on St. James Street to St. George Street, noting as you go St. James Court, an elegant brick apartment building at 200 St. James Street, built in 1926, one of the best small apartment buildings in the city. The northwest corner of St. James and St. George was once part of the campus of Huron College, a campus which stretched north to Grosvenor Street and west to the Thames River. Huron College was founded in 1863 as a training facility for Anglican priests needed to serve the rapidly growing communities around London. The institution was strongly associated with Bishop Isaac Hellmuth, London's second Anglican bishop and one of the most fascinating characters in London's history. Associated with several London North institutions, Hellmuth was a Polish Jew who converted to Christianity while studying in England and subsequently established himself in London, where he applied his apparently boundless energy to attempting to create an educational system equal to England's on the colonial frontier. While his ambitions proved far greater than the London area could support in the 1860s and 70s, London's role as a university centre would eventually grow almost entirely out of his work. Huron College remained on this site, housed in a large, if architecturally uninspired, structure until 1951, when it relocated to its current site on Western Road, and the old college buildings were demolished to make room for an apartment complex. Walk 3 blocks north on St. George Street to Cromwell Street. Just north of Cromwell, on the west side of St. George, you'll see a large Tudor house, set back from the west side of the street. Thornwood, at 329 St. George Street, was built in 1852 for Henry Beecher, a successful London lawyer who, in addition to his other talents and interests, served as architect for his own residence. Beecher had been active in suppressing the rebellion of 1837, and was well connected with every layer of government. Among the men who were guests at the house were Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, the future King Edward VII, then Prince of Wales, and a young Winston Churchill. Beechers House was the first residence in London to be constructed entirely of brick, and when built was well outside the built-up area of the city. The facade visible from the street is, unfortunately, the house's rear, with the principal facade oriented towards the bluffs overlooking the Thames River. The smaller structure to the north was built as Thornwood's stables. Return a block south on St. George Street to Grosvenor, then left, walking east on Grosvenor Street. Stop at 36 Grosvenor. The wooden house at 36 Grosvenor was built for William Percival in 1886. Percival was engaged in the milling business and wanted to use his house to advertise the possibilities of ornamental woodwork and architecture, and over the extent of the building you'll see nearly every kind of woodwork imaginable. Despite the effort, the house was one of the last substantial London houses to be built in wood. Continue east on Grosvenor Street to the intersection of Richmond and Grosvenor Streets. The southwest corner of Richmond and Grosvenor was once the site of the Mount Hope Orphanage. The site was a nucleus of Roman Catholic activities in the city, and in addition to housing the orphanage, the complex included a convent and home for the elderly. The site first came into Catholic hands in 1857, but it wasn't until 1877 that Joseph Connolly, one of London's leading architects, was commissioned to design a large brick Gothic structure for the site. The site has served a number of Catholic institutions over the 19th and 20th centuries. Connolly's masterpiece was demolished in 1980, and the site has now been incorporated into the St. Joseph's Hospital complex. The complex on the northeast corner of Richmond and Grosvenor is St. Joseph's Hospital, founded by the Roman Catholic Church in 1888, and run by the Sisters of St. Joseph's, resident at Mount Hope. The first significant construction on the site was an impressive structure designed by the architectural firm of Moore and Henry in 1892, a large building symmetrically arranged around a central tower. The hospital complex has been expanded dozens of times, transforming itself into one of London's largest medical facilities. Of particular note is a 1923 structure on Richmond Street, designed by Watt and Blackwell. The Renaissance Revival Chapel in the structure is one of the few interiors of that style in London, and well worth stepping into before continuing on your walk. Enter off Richmond Street. The chapel is on the second floor. From the intersection of Richmond and Grosvenor, walk east a block on Grosvenor Street to Wellington Street, then turn left and walk a block south on Wellington to St. James Street. The church on the northeast corner of Wellington and St. James is St. John the Evangelist Anglican, the only church in the London area with a rood screen. The congregation began its life in 1864, worshipping in Huron College's chapel. In 1887, they had grown large enough to erect their own structure, an impressive Gothic parish church. The architect was nominally George Durand, but the design appears to have actually come from Charles Cox, an employee of Durand's who was also a parishioner of St. John the Evangelist. The church is architecturally one of the finest small parishes in the London area, somehow managing to be both dramatic and yet not feel out of place on a quiet residential street. Turn left, walking a block east on St. James Street to Hellmuth Avenue. You're standing just to the south of the Hellmuth Boys' School. Isaac Hellmuth, a figure associated with the founding of Huron College in 1862, was determined to establish London as the educational centre of Southwestern Ontario. In addition to the founding of an Anglican seminary, he established two private schools, institutions which came to be popularly known as the Hellmuth Boys' School and the Hellmuth Ladies' School. The schools were intended to provide a level of education well above that available in the public school system at the time, and the boys' school was notable for its focus on the physical sciences, a topic rarely taught in the high school level in the 1860s. The girls' school was located on a site north of the Thames River, then well outside the city. The boys' school, however, occupied a large portion of the north end, the ground stretching from Oxford to Grosvenor and Wellington to Waterloo. London architect William Robinson was commissioned to design an impressively large structure for the school, but the institution failed to live up to the high hopes invested in it, struggling both to find students and to balance its budget from the moment it opened. The school was forced to close its doors in 1877. Undeterred, Hellmuth had already developed new plans for the site. By the 1870s, many of the graduates of Huron College were advocating for the establishment of a full university at London. A group was accordingly formed, led by Bishop Hellmuth, to establish the University of Western Ontario in the recently abandoned facilities of the Hellmuth Boys' School. Like the boys' school, however, the university was a financial disaster from the beginning, and in 1885 the university was forced to abandon its original building and move into smaller quarters. Surprisingly, especially to local naysayers, the university would eventually rebuild, developing into an important educational institution in the early 20th century, and eventually establishing itself on its current campus in 1922. The Hellmuth Boys' School, however, faced a less happy fate, the school's property being sold to a developer who demolished the building in 1894 and subdivided the site into 4 blocks of residential building plots. We've reached the end of our walk. To return to the beginning, walk a block south on Hellmuth Avenue to Oxford Street. Turn left, and walk 2 blocks east on Oxford to Colburn Street. Alternately, you could wander northward through the fine residential streets north of St. Joseph's Hospital.